Thank you very much for joining us, everyone. Welcome to the Carbon Forum, which is hosted by MaiaGrazing, and this is the second forum in this session. The first forum was looking at the Wilmot Cattle Company case study and their carbon story, and today we're going to be focusing on Cavan Station. I'm joined today by four very interesting, innovative and experienced panelists who I'd like to introduce you to, and I'm not going to provide a big bio on each of them because you've all got access to the internet, so you can look them up. You can look on the MaiaGrazing website to see the areas of expertise that people come to today. First of all, we've got Matt Crozier, who's the General Manager for Cavan Station, who'll be the focus of our forum today. We've got Peter Richardson, the CEO of MaiaGrazing. We've got Dr. Terry McCosker, who's the Director of RCS, and we've got Doug McNichol joining us, who's the Program Manager for Sustainable Innovation with Meat and Livestock Australia. I'm your host and mediator today. My name's Suze Orgel, and I'm a soil carbon researcher with New South Wales Department of Primary Industries. So I'm joining you from Canberra today. This is very cold Canberra. So as I said to those who joined earlier, make sure in the chat function, tell us where you're from so we can see who's joining us today, and try and use 5 words to describe why soil carbon is important to you and your production system. Now, as I said, I'm the host today. A bit of background on me. My area of research is soil carbon. I'm extremely passionate about farm-ready research. So I want to know what we can do differently to increase soil carbon in our pastoral systems and our cropping systems as well. My pathway to this place, I guess maybe I was a bit obsessed with making mud pies as a little girl. When I first joined DPI about 15 years ago, I was running soil health workshops, looking at more recipe style agriculture, where we go, right, we need X, Y, and Z to grow a crop. You need nitrogen, you need phosphorus, you need potassium. And we'd always end these workshops, which were run across New South Wales, with producers going, what about soil carbon? Isn't that like the energy source driving all of our production systems? What about soil microbes? So I went off and embarked on a PhD, which looked at farm management strategies to increase soil carbon, and I have not looked back. I've got more questions now than I probably had before I started, without a doubt. I want to start today's discussion by asking our panelists to introduce themselves and tell us what led them to be part of today's forum. So why are they interested in soil carbon, and what changes have they seen in the soil carbon space? And I'm going to start with someone who's been interested in soil carbon for decades, who I first met at a conference quite some years ago after many emails asking him lots and lots of questions, because he's an expert in this area, and I had so many questions that I wanted him to answer. And at the break at a conference, like many of you online have probably done, I lined up with a pack of graziers to ask Dr. Terry McCosker a question and introduce myself and say, I'm the person at the end of the email, and have not looked back in terms of what I've learned from Terry. So Terry, tell us, welcome today, and also tell us, why are you here and what changes have you seen in the past few decades in the soil carbon space?
Thank you, Suze, and welcome everybody. That was a pretty impressive introduction, Suze. I don't know whether I can take credit for all of that. I've been involved in grazing management and actually introduced the time control grazing management systems to Australia back in the late 80s. And I realised after 10 or 15 years that a lot of the graziers that we're working with were improving their soils and potentially improving soil carbon. And then I heard about these interesting things called carbon credits. And I thought 15 years ago that it'd be great if we could get farmers paid for what they're doing for the environment. And quite frankly, if I knew then what I know now, I never would have started down this pathway. It's been the most tortuous, difficult, slow-moving pathway that I think I've ever been on. But I do believe we're now getting to almost a crescendo in the noise and the activity in the soil carbon space, which is really great to see. And one of the things that we've spent a lot of time working on while we couldn't do much else was how to measure soil carbon accurately. And we're down to a level now where we're actually able to measure stock plus or minus around about 1 tonne, which is quite a good accuracy, and we're pretty excited by that.
Thanks, Terry. And just a reminder, everyone, tell us where you're from in the chat function. And if you've got any questions for our panelists as we go through today, use the Q&A section on the Zoom meeting. All right, I'm going to go next to Peter. Peter, tell us about yourself and why you're here today and the role perhaps that grazing management and your expertise plays in this space.
Hi, Suze and everyone. So I run MaiaGrazing, and we provide, as most people would know, we provide tools to help with grazing management. And I think that we're at this really exciting time, but my background is actually in systems and processes and IT, and I'm all about systematizing things and using the data to improve the way that we systematize things. That's my background. I've been involved in setting up companies that do carbon projects up the top end, but I'm really passionate about grazing management because I can see that grazing management is one of the keys to solve this great problem of how we're going to improve our soils and sequester more carbon out of the atmosphere. It's the lowest cost way of doing that, and I'm just very passionate about trying to get it to happen. So I think that there's this beautiful crossover, there's this beautiful synergy between contributing to the whole problem around climate change and monetized solutions to doing that, and at the same time improving the lot of farmers, which and in particular, in our case, livestock producers, which have a pretty tough time. I think that what we're talking about today is just a beautiful solution that brings those two things together. It helps us to improve the viability and the productivity of producers, and at the same time solve a really devilishly hard problem that Terry was talking about before. And to answer your question about change, I guess I'll give you one interesting thought, and that is that the conversations that we're having with prospective customers has changed quite a lot over the last 12 months or so, 12 to 18 months. So 12 to 18 months ago, we would have people coming saying, we want to look at whether your tools can help us. We've just been through a horrible drought and we never want to go through that again. It caused us a whole lot of problems and we just never want to go through it again. And the conversation that we're having now is quite different. The conversation that we're having now, they're starting to use words like natural capital, and they're starting to use words like, how can we improve our soil, and what's this carbon thing, and how does it impact what I can be doing in the long term? So we are starting to have conversations that are looking ahead and thinking about the long term and the way that they can build their land. And I have seen that is a noticeable change that's happened over the last 12 to 18 months. And, I think it's pretty exciting.
It is very exciting. We've moved on from that space. We're going, oh, there's so much uncertainty and there's no data. There is a truckload of data out there to show practices which can increase soil carbon. And the challenge is for producers to, I guess, embrace and make that context specific for them. So take those tools out of the toolbox, Peter, like you just said, and put it in practice. And for industry, I guess, to help in that supporting and enabling them. So speaking about industry, let's go to Doug McNichol. Doug, tell us, you're here today representing Meat and Livestock Australia. Why are you interested in soil carbon, and what changes have you seen from an industry perspective?
Hi, Susan, and hi, everyone. Great to be with you. So for those of you who don't understand MLA's remit, we're a not-for-profit research and development corporation that invests producer levies, government and voluntary cash contributions into new knowledge and technologies to support the sustainable development of beef, sheep meat and goat meat producers in Australia. As a program manager in the business, my remit is enabling new environmental service models for producers that ultimately reward them for providing environmental services alongside red meat production. And so I'm here today to talk to panelists and also share ideas and thoughts on how best we can enable that for producers. Soil carbon is one of the environmental services that we're seeing producers providing alongside other natural capital services, for example. And what's really great about soil carbon is, as we all know on the call, if you can get carbon in your soils, it provides multiple benefits. So there's a clear soil health benefit that translates into a clear animal productivity benefit that translates into an environmental value for the community. And by packaging that up for farmers, they can be rewarded for providing that service. So that's why I'm here, and there's some of the benefits we're seeing in industry and focusing in this area.
And I like the language change now. It's not about going if it works, it's like when it works, this is the benefits that we're seeing. So there's published data out there that shows that increasing soil organic carbon returns in terms of productivity benefits with access to water and nutrients, the value of up to $95 per hectare per year. Like, that's not talking about trading, that's just talking about the productivity benefits of increasing soil organic matter on your farms. So we talk about soil carbon, but the pumps that put the carbon in the soil are plants, and our plant and soil managers are represented here today by Matt Crozier. So Matt, I'm going to ask you the same question, and then we're going to do a bit of a deep dive into Cavan Station. So why are you interested in soil organic carbon? And as a producer, what changes have you seen in this space?
Yeah, thanks, Suze. Look, we got interested in soil health really about 10 years ago at Cavan. I came here and it was a large grazing operation that was sort of, you know, like most grazing operations, had come through a couple of droughts and really felt we hadn't maybe managed them as well as we could have, and we wanted to build more resilience into our landscapes. So we got really interested in soil health predominantly, which then sort of led to natural capital. So in a roundabout way, we then realised there was this thing called carbon, and organic carbon, that was really driving the whole system. So that was our journey. It was about the farming journey. It was about building resilience, and it was about a human journey of bringing a team of staff along the way with us to understanding and having more of a mindset towards plants and grass and soil rather than always a livestock focus.
Thanks, Matt. So tell us a bit about the Microsoft story. So we're here today to talk about the ins and outs of Cavan Station participating, I guess, in this market, which has kind of got them $500,000 worth of carbon credits through Microsoft. Tell us about how you heard about it, what you did to get engaged, and what you've done differently to increase soil carbon.
Yeah, okay, thanks. So obviously it kind of came about because of our management change. We were seeing that our organic carbon levels were increasing. We also were doing lots of other sort of natural capital initiatives.
Sorry, I'm going to jump in there. What management change?
Mainly grazing management change and data collection.
Yeah, so what does that look like?
You know, so that what we went from was a really large sort of sheep grazing operation that was predominantly set stocked to, you know, over a period of 5 or 6 or 7 years, going to full planned rotational grazing, and empowering the staff to have the tools and the techniques to be able to do that. So the ability to be able to collect data on grazing management, be able to feed budget, to be able to plan rotations, to, you know, enable rest periods. So we're really looking at plants and soil health. So through this, we sort of realised that, you know, we'd come a fair way, and we wanted to work out ways we could consider monetising natural capital. So we were working with consultants to find ways that we might be able to, you know, entice a brand, you know, through insetting, or sell our wool or our meat in a way that we might be recognised for the natural capital initiatives that we'd undertaken. The consultants we were working with came forward with this, you know, Grassland Plus package that they put together with sort of the regen network in the States, and they had willing buyers ready to purchase this carbon product in a private market sense. So that's sort of how it came about. It obviously sparked our interest greatly, and we looked further into it and found that because of the data we'd collected, we could participate in this opportunity.
And so what does participating look like? What have you had to do in terms of collecting data? What type of data? What type of frequency?
Yeah, so look, it was basically annual soil testing that we'd been carrying out for our own management information. You know, we've been collecting organic carbon measurements in our soil since about 2015. So we had a body of data there. We obviously had pretty intense grazing management data that was accumulated through the use of MaiaGrazing. So then we also had, you know, we had to prove that there'd been significant management change to benefit the landscape. So that we're also able to talk about all the other kind of initiatives around tree planting and riparian restoration zones and biological set-aside areas on top of the data we had on soil and grazing management.
And that's what I like about this. It's the whole package, right? So it's not just about soil, it's about the plants and the people, but also the landscape in which this kind of deal is operating in. So Terry, I just want to ask you a quick question. We've got a question online about how you go about establishing a baseline. So before we come back to Cavan Station and the Microsoft deal, did you want to give us just a 1 or 2 minute overview about establishing a baseline for a soil carbon project?
Yeah, thanks, Sue. So it really starts off with a registration process with the government. You can't do a baseline until a project is registered, and that can be a 3, 4, 5 month process. And then once it's registered, then basically you're going to go to contract on where are you selling it, who's actually doing the work for you, etc. And then your baseline starts. Now the baseline is based on some pretty interesting work with satellites and aerial work, etc., to begin with, to work out where's the variability in the landscape. And once you've got a good handle on the variability in the landscape, that landscape then is broken into what's called carbon estimation areas. Now, there might only be one of those, but on different titles, you may have different carbon estimation areas. And then within a carbon estimation area, there are strata. And the strata are used to help keep the sampling to, as well as we can, discrete land types within the property. That reduces the variability of the sampling. And then the baseline also includes not just the soil sampling, but also includes a 10-year history, which is coming back to a 5-year history of emissions. So your baseline includes the number of livestock you've been carrying, the fertilizer you've been using, any irrigation you've been doing, the fuel you've been using, etc., is all included in your baseline. So as you go forwards, if you were to increase livestock over and above your baseline numbers, then you have a methane emission to account for over and above that baseline. If fuel goes over and above what you used to use, then that also has to be accounted and taken off the abatement that you've actually done within your soils. So that's sort of a fairly simple overview of it, Suze.
Yeah, no, thanks, Terry. And I guess for me, the key there is when Terry was talking about strata. So for those of you playing along at home, if you think about if you've got clay pans and non-clay pans, you'd separate those out as different strata. And the better you can do that with your baseline sampling, the more accurate your estimations can be. So you can reduce the error. And the reason we want to reduce the error is then there can be a more sensitive measure about your actual carbon sequestration rates. So that stratification, which different companies use, is really key. And you guys at home, it's knowing more about your landscape and where we take the samples is really, really important. Had a question on the line.
Can I add something, Sue?
So yes.
Oh, just the other advantage of the stratification, as well as in lowering the error, is you can lower the cost, of course, which is really key, because what Terry's talking about is a fairly comprehensive process that involves some real costs.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I'm going to come to you about grazing management in just 1 second, but I just wanted to answer online. People were asking about the depth to which we sample. So for the Australian national market, and we generally and internationally, we look at soil carbon to 30 centimetres when we're collecting that, but you can also look beyond that as on the Australian market. So you can do the 30 plus centimetres, so subsoil. But Matt, the question is around for your Microsoft deal, what sampling depths were you using? The Microsoft project?
The the sampling depth in this situation was only 15 centimetres.
Yeah.
Which, because it was a fairly standard soil test that we were doing just for management purposes anyway, since 2015, that was the sampling depth that was occurring. And obviously, I stressed that it was a private market deal. So obviously, the sort of methodology was slightly different to the methodology under the ERF, or regulated by the Clean Energy Regulator. So in our situation, that's what we have. We want to look into, carbon at further depth down the track. That's probably the next frontier for us, is sort of thinking about, carbon at depth. But in this situation, for this deal, it was 15 centimetres.
And in pasture situations, that subsoil carbon sequestration can be quite significant because our soils are generally saturated at depth. And also then you can capture that soil building process. So we're adding layers of carbon into the soil, which is key. I guess about the Cavan Station project as well, there's information available online about how they've done the sampling. I think, is that the same as Wilmot? So there's like that level of transparency if you want to have a look into what's been done and why, and what Matt's provided is a nice context about how it's worked. So Peter, I just wanted to go to you and talk about grazing before I go to Doug and talk about, I guess, carbon neutrality. Grazing management, we've heard, plays such an important role. So does data. So give us a bit of an insight about your experience in the role of data provision in not only improving decision making, but collecting evidence.
Okay, good question. And I guess bringing that back to carbon, I guess the first point I would make is that a lot of people think that the big benefit in using a digital tool in the context of these carbon projects is that you've got all this great data about the livestock and the pasture, and that can all flow through to the carbon project developer and lower the costs of the project and make it easier to sort of quantify the carbon and the emissions and all the rest of it. And that's definitely true, but it's not the real reason that you want to use digital tools. The real reason is that the tools will help you to make better decisions around your grazing management. And it's those better decisions that produce better pasture yields, and it's those better pasture yields that are going to give you these soil and carbon outcomes. And the sorts of data that we can help with is, for example, helping to get the stocking rate exactly right against its current carrying capacity, because that's bouncing around all the time as conditions change. And so it's tricky to really get your stocking rate correct. But that's kind of the first and most fundamental step in sort of getting your grazing management under control. And then secondly, you can use all of that data to create feed budgets and grazing plans, and you can be forecasting out the consequences of the decisions that you might want to make to see how it affects your longer term stocking rate and the supply and demand equation around the pasture. And then finally, you can also get detailed analytics around the way that you're increasing the density of your grazers and how you're managing your rest periods. And all of these things flow into basically managing the growth of that pasture to get higher yields and therefore more activity under the soil, and therefore this nice side benefit of carbon. You can do it all without the data, but it's really hard once you get into any sort of non-trivial commercial environment. Using the data just makes it easier to get those decisions right.
And from my experience, producers are totally data hungry, right? The more information, the better. And I think we've already heard that today. Just a reminder, if you can pop your questions in the Q&A section, because I'm trying to balance the chat field as well as the Q&A part as I'm looking and listening at the same time. But Doug, over to you. What's industry doing to champion, I guess, the role of producers in being part of a nature-based solution? And what's your kind of view on, I guess, the private market versus the government market? Are you engaging on both kind of fronts with your carbon neutrality? That was a question from the floor.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sue. Two questions there, and I've got a short-term memory, so I'll deal with the first one. You probably have to remind me of the second one.
So do I. That's why I asked them both.
Yeah. So look, in terms of what is MLA doing, and speaking on behalf of industry. So the Australian red meat industry launched the Carbon Neutral 2030 initiative in 2017, And so that means net zero greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2030. So Terry touched on this. We think about our grazing system. There's things that we do to produce red meat that results in emissions. And then there is things that we do to produce red meat that enables us to pull and capture carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and store it in soils or stable vegetation types. And so the industry recognised that residing over half of Australia's landmass, which equates to about 355 million hectares, maybe we're in a pretty good place to provide some really good services on behalf of Australia more broadly and Australia's red meat consumers and community. So we've put in place that initiative, and MLA's role has been supporting the research and development and adoption pathways. So, not surprisingly, we're really focused on this notion of livestock methane emissions, which is a byproduct of animal digestion. And so innovative technologies like forages, feed additives, genetic selection, complemented by grazing management practices so that we reduce methane emissions, whilst at the same time looking at how we can configure plant technology in the grazing environment and then use the right grazing principles to promote carbon sequestration and storage is a critical part of the industry's CN30 initiative. And I encourage all of the viewers online, if you haven't had a chance, check out the red meat industry's carbon neutral 2030 roadmap. It kind of illustrates, what we're trying to do in the path ahead. But to your other part of your question, which was around, what is the industry doing more broadly to position Australian red meat as being part of a solution, the climate solution. MLA is also a marketing, provides marketing services or generic marketing services to industry, and that includes things like the Good Meat website, which is a community-facing web channel for us to disseminate just common sense information to the community about the benefits of red meat production in a future climate. So check out the Good Meat website, www.goodmeat.com.au, and you can receive information that way. And two other points I'll make. We recently released a Green Fast Facts initiative. And the reason we did that was to try and arm industry stakeholders with some short, sharp, punchy, factual-based statements to communicate better with the community about our credentials. And those credentials are not only environmental, but nutritional and animal welfare credentials. And then lastly, some of the participants online might be aware that there is a UN Food Systems Summit upcoming in September. And on that agenda is quite a robust discussion about sustainable food systems. And so the Australian red meat industry, which is comprised of MLA as being one stakeholder, but peak advocacy bodies and the government are preparing a dialogue or have been participating in dialogues to help us prepare information for that Food Systems Summit. So that's kind of what we're doing to position red meat. And then the other aspect of your question was, I knew I'd forget it. What was it? What was the second question?
No idea, but we're going to keep going. I'll remember it and then I'll come back to it.
No worries.
That's good. So Matt, I'm about to go to you and ask you about carbon sequestration rates based on the method that you've kind of outlined to us. But I just wanted to answer a question online. Is it easier to build soil carbon if the soil is more degraded? So yeah, but like that, I hate it when my kids say that. It drives me nuts. But anyway, that's the answer I'm going to give. So the reason I say that is if you have a low starting soil organic carbon level, yes, you can potentially get more rapid increases in the concentration and stock of carbon because you've got a lower saturation level, right? So, and we know that the data's there, so you can get these more rapid increases. But the thing that stumped me with that question was about being degraded. So certainly if you have a high carbon system and you have a soil that is functioning well, that system can also be very responsive to things like grazing management change as well. So you can have these carbon almost boosting activities or practices. So lower the starting level, yeah, the bigger the bucket you have to fill. But even if your bucket is already halfway filled or towards the top, there's still things that you can do to increase soil carbon. Sometimes what can happen in your high carbon soils is it can be more challenging to detect those smaller incremental changes though. So that was my 2 seconds worth. Now I'm going to go to Matt. We've got a question about carbon sequestration rates that you're seeing based on your measurements now to 15 centimetres. So just reminding everyone, that's what we're talking about. What kind of rates are you looking at in terms of carbon sequestration?
Look, it varies greatly depending on rainfall, biological activity, plant growth, soil type. It's very hard to kind of put a blanket number across the farm. Obviously, our operations, 25,000 odd acres in the southern tablelands. We've got very, very diverse range of soil types. But I think in very broad terms, in the period that we were paid the credit for from 2017 to 2020, we're talking about sort of organic carbon rates of going from about 3.2% to about 3.6% over that 3-year period. How that equates in sequestration rates and hard, tons of carbon per hectare, I'm not really a soil scientist, so I can't really answer for that. But that's the sort of, we just set out on the path of trying to increase organic carbon rates, as rapidly as possible, heading towards knowing that we thought a rough figure we plucked out of our head was if we get all our country above 4%, we'll start to get the sort of production gains that we want to get out of our pastures. So yeah, that's the sort of level we've done in the 3-year period.
Excellent. And our work has shown, or the work I've been involved with, has shown sequestration rates with either land use change or practice change of up to 2.5 tonnes per hectare per year. Terry, what's some of the work that you've done?
Just to take up Matt's point, is a very, very rough rule of thumb. 0.1% change in organic carbon is roughly a tonne of carbon per hectare. It doesn't always work like that, but it's in the ballpark. I think it depends on 3 things: rainfall, temperature, and soil type. So the ideal situation is a clay-based soil in a cold environment with high rainfall, anything above sort of 600 or 700 metres. And then as you take one of those away, the sequestration rate will fall. And in our experience, you can actually take one of those 3 away and still get a reasonable sequestration rate. I think the literature, average across a lot of the literature, is suggesting that in grazing systems, somewhere between 1 and 1.5 tonnes of carbon per hectare per year would be in the ballpark. As we move up into Queensland systems and drier areas, we work on 0.5 tonne or less. I just did some sums and looked up some data in rangelands using water harvesting, and that's around about 0.2 of a tonne of carbon per hectare per year. And that would work when you've got, 10 or 20,000 hectares of that sort of landscape. So, somewhere in that sort of 1.5 tonnes. And I think, and in cropping, the average change we've seen in the literature is around about 1.4 something tonnes per hectare. So again, it's possible to make those changes in cropping systems. But the whole thing is not so much what the carbon is, it's what's the practice change that you're going to make to create this. That's the really key thing. And in livestock, it's grazing management, which is the first thing. But I think we're starting to see that we need other things as well. So adding legumes, for example, to having nitrogen in the system to be able to hold the carbon in the soil is a very key part of sequestering carbon. But I'll pull up there, Suze. I can go on for hours otherwise.
That's a good point. So in our grazing systems, well, actually in any system, nitrogen plays a really important role in increasing soil organic carbon, because of course we measure carbon, but what we're actually looking at is soil organic matter. And soil organic matter is about 58% carbon by weight and 42% other stuff, and the other stuff includes nitrogen. So nitrogen is really important. So we've got our free-living nitrogen-fixing bacteria. We've also got our legumes, so our rhizobia, which are associated with them. And nitrogen is key to increasing soil carbon, and legumes are a great way to do that because there's plenty of nitrogen in the atmosphere. There's a question here about, is there a limit to how much carbon can be added to the soil, and if sequestration rates slow or eventually stop? So generally you get the most rapid increase in the first 5 to 10 years after practice change or land use change, and then it increases at a decreasing rate until you get your next disturbance, so the next kind of change which might increase soil organic carbon. But what Terry said is really important, the context around soil type and climate, and that's what you guys are working within. So think about what your canvas is and what you can and can't do within that area. Matt, question from the floor: did carbon vary or drop when you in around 2019? I'm looking at drought. What's the impact of drought on some of the levels that you've seen?
Yeah, so we saw a very, very rapid increase in the carbon in the good season of sort of 2016, 2017, leading into the early part of 2018. Obviously, we then hit a pretty severe drought, and we saw the rate of sequestration really plateau. So we still came out very positively over the 3-year period, but there was definitely split into 2 halves. You know, when we had rainfall, we were sequestering rapidly. When we had no rainfall, that plateaued right off. That's what we saw.
Could I just jump in there, Suze? One of the things that we've noticed there as well with the drought is that we didn't actually lose carbon during that period. We obviously don't gain it when you haven't got photosynthesis operating, but it's important, and I think Matt just pointed out that he didn't lose it. And as long as you're managing effectively, maintaining your ground cover is a really key part of that, then you're likely to keep it but not sequester it.
Yeah, there's a slide that I like to use with one of our replicated trials, a long-term trial, 18 years worth of data. And what you see during the millennium drought is our carbon, it doesn't increase at the same rate, but it certainly doesn't decrease with drought. It stays the same or just slowly keeps going, because that was the role of good management in that replicated trial. So it's really important. Ground cover is going to be essential in keeping carbon in the soil as well. So Matt, there's a question around, I guess, the program that Cavan Station has used and other people in Australia are using on the voluntary market. So how do you market what you're doing? How do you sell your narrative? What advice do you have for others who are listening online?
Look, advice. So advice is it's all about data. It's about having the data. It's about collecting the data. But it's about changing mindset. So it's about changing management, and it's about changing the mindset to think about every decision that we're taking on the farm. Is it taking us towards building carbon, or is it taking us away from that? So obviously, you know, it's just, for us, it's about principles. You know, it's about fluctuating the stock numbers according to you know, rainfall. It's about planning our grazing, feed budgeting. It's about maintaining ground cover. It's about encouraging biodiversity. It's you know, getting that legume content. It's you know, reducing chemical usage. You know, so those sorts of mindset decisions or mindset change is what's taking us in the right direction, I feel. And then, you know, how do you go and market all that? Well, you know, I don't know. We were lucky enough that the Regen network came along with a particular, you know, packaged product that we could participate in. You know, what's the next frontier? Well, I think it's probably more baselining, like proper baselining. Probably the cost to collect that data will be increased over the cost of you know, the current project we've participated in. But that's probably the next frontier for us, I think.
Excellent. And what we're hearing today is it's like not spooky science. There's no crystals and caftans, right? Like, we're talking about really solid, good practices which increase production, as well as having these really important productivity outcomes. So a question that's been asked from the floor, I'm going to put it to the whole panel. So jump in and fight for your space and your comments on this. Do you think the private market's going to be bigger than the government market?
I'll jump in first. Absolutely, no doubt about that. The government market is really a catalyst to get this thing started, but what we're seeing is a massive increase in demand for credits. But in Australia, they have to be ACCUs, so they have to be Australian Carbon Credit Units, because the people who really need them want to offset with the official ACCU credits and not the Microsoft or the regen type credit. So I think there's two markets. There's the one that Matt has taken, which is the non-regulated market. But I think that what we're seeing is the increase in value will be in the regulated market.
I'll just say I absolutely agree. The private market is the really hot area at the moment. The private sector is way ahead of government on all of this. But the government schemes are really important because they kind of underpin, the whole thing and provide a sort of foundational level. So they're both important, but the private market is going absolutely gangbusters at the moment.
For us, obviously the barrier to entry was lower with the private market deal. You know, there was some significant advantages for us in that the carbon was grandfathered. We were getting paid for historical carbon, whereas, you know, under the regulator, it would only go from what carbon we fixed from today going forward. So that to us was a big advantage. Yeah, but I think as Terry and Peter have both said, both markets are important, but yeah, I see the private market becoming absolutely massive.
Susan, there's another slightly different way of thinking about that marketing question, is asking yourself fundamentally, who is paying and what are they consuming? So we spoke about the government market and the voluntary market. Another way of thinking about that for people who are hearing this for the first time, the community is one consumer of carbon credits. And so when we say the government is acting on behalf of taxpayers in Australia. And so taxpayers are the consumer of the carbon credit, so that when the Australian government attends the Paris Agreement negotiations, can show what the Australian community has purchased. Another consumer is corporates. So they are businesses like Microsoft who are looking to buy carbon credits to offset their activities. So they're a private customer, they're a private consumer. And the third consumer of carbon credits is a red meat consumer or an agricultural commodity consumer, whether it's food or fibre. And the marketing avenues to reach those three customers are different. So in the instance of the red meat consumer, that's through a branded program where the carbon credit is equated to the amount of product they consume, and the consumer consumes it and retires that. So they're actually quite clear and distinct marketing avenues that is important for producers to understand before they commit to a pathway. And what would be interesting is some interesting economic analysis, because the marketing considerations change over time as those consumers are willing to pay more or less.
Thanks, everyone. So we've heard a lot about the benefits, but I want to just quickly whip around. So what are the benefits from each of your different organisations and backgrounds of increasing soil organic carbon? And you've only got 30 seconds to tell us. I'm going to start with you, Doug, because you're online. I can see you in front of me. Why should we be increasing soil carbon? 30 seconds.
Environmental value for the community, production value for the consumer, and an economic monetisation opportunity for the producer.
Diversifying farm income. Terry?
Water holding capacity, cation exchange capacity, and increasing productivity, and that flowing through to animal health and profitability.
Peter?
Improved production flowing through to improve profitability is number one. And secondly, resilience to changes in conditions like droughts. That's what you get from better soil.
Yeah. Okay, Matt, what about you? You've listed some.
Yeah, drought resilience is the big one, and being able to manage a variable climate and obviously reducing risk in your business.
So why aren't people doing it, right? Why isn't this more of a focus? What are the barriers, right? Like we all agree, there's data, there's farmers, there's industry. What are the barriers that we're facing? Start with you, Matt, and then jump in, everyone.
I think some of the barriers are that some farmers aren't necessarily collecting the right data. So we did touch on farmers love data, but some people aren't collecting necessarily the right data. They don't have the soil data going back historically. And I think it's a paradigm shift. It requires a paradigm shift in mindset to just change the focus from being, if you're a livestock producer, change the focus from being all about livestock and livestock production goals, and being more about the landscape you're running the livestock on.
Jump in, guys.
Oh, okay, I'll jump in. First of all, inertia. Inertia is always a problem. There's always a tendency to keep doing things the way you have been doing things, where what we're talking about here with grazing management is making some small incremental improvements that have big changes. But I think the other thing that I think we can all learn from is that I think up until recently, we haven't done a good job as an industry of sharing the actual data about what's happening in places like Matt's, where he's actually improved his production measurably. And the business case for that improved production is very, very strong in terms of what it cost him to deliver that improved production. The carbon was just a bit of stuff that sort of popped out the end. And I think as an industry, we need to do a much better job of raising the awareness using data of the possibilities in terms of improved production outcomes from some of these changes. And I don't think there's a widespread understanding of that at the moment. And therefore, people aren't sort of rushing in the way that we might have expected.
Yeah.
I probably got 4 points, Sue. So you can't make it rain. You can't change soil type. Baselining costs and measurement have been traditionally high, but is rapidly reducing in costs. And the willingness to change grazing management is highly variable. There are probably some key barriers I see that represent behavioural mindset, and then also some fundamental environmental and technological limitations.
So why don't people want to change grazing management, Doug?
That's a very interesting social science question that I don't have a short. I know you want short and punchy answers, Sue, so I'm not sure I have a short and punchy answer.
Spotlight's on you. We need a solution. I'm going to give you 5 seconds.
Yeah, sure. So I think this is going to be crude, but sometimes it's old dogs, new tricks. I think sometimes there's learnt behaviours that producers, they do something and they become very familiar with it, reluctant to change. And so often there's a change in management required or a generational shift required as being the opportunity to influence that change. So that's one way of approaching it.
Yeah. And it's like that kind of not the model of us running out and doing our research and then coming to you with a paper 5 years later and go, here you go, we showed that it worked or it didn't work. And if you have access to that journal, which most people don't now, you can see it. Like, it's about producers being part of the research, right? So we're answering their questions, speaking as a researcher, which is kind of one of the projects that a few people online are collaborating with on an MLA funded project. That's exactly what we're doing. Producers are at the table with the researchers and we're answering their questions about grazing management.
I'm
Matt.
very keen to hear what Terry's got to say, Suze, because he's made an entire career of helping people to adopt these changes. Terry, don't be silent.
I think the first one is that when it comes to carbon itself, there's been talk for the last 10 or 15 years from government and everyone else, and including myself, without any action, without anything, money being put on the table. And I've always said that when the money hit the table, the interest level would increase. The money's just hit the table through Matt and through Wilmot. And I think that has significantly changed the interest around doing soil carbon. One of the other barriers in terms of carbon itself has actually been the government, the methodologies and the regulations. We've been regulated almost into non-existence, and there's been, and quite frankly, with a lot of the methodologies, we have not been able to recognise, ask producers to actually use those methodologies because A, they're expensive, B, they're inaccurate, and C, you're not going to get paid for most of the credits you actually produce. So we've had a regulatory issue. Hopefully that's changing because we're about to get our 3rd soil carbon methodology in Australia, and I'm hoping that some of those barriers will be gone. And I think there's another area, and that is science itself has got in the way. And I think that, it's pretty easy to pick up publications right now and tell you that cell grazing and holistic management and planned grazing don't work. That's the scientific evidence, which is 180 degrees opposed to thousands and thousands of case studies and anecdotal evidence. So I think that science itself has actually slowed this down and created doubt in the minds of people about changing to a different method of of grazing management. So I think there's actually a lot of reasons for this. I don't think there's any one that we can point to that's the one.
Matt, what do you reckon? Speaking as a producer, it seems like, is there some people on the chat are saying maybe it's a bit overwhelming. There's so much information out there. It's hard to know where to start.
Yeah, look, I agree with all the other points. I just think that the greatest carrot, as Terry touched on, is the deal that we've done. So the deal, if you think about the deal we've done as an example, if that's not an incentivisation program for every farmer to consider just some basic management change to be able to participate in an extra form of revenue, that's what's going to drive uptake change of changing grazing management and more collection of data, without a doubt.
Ken, Matt, wanted to ask you about, because there's a few questions. What's the return on investment? Like, how much has it cost you? And then I'm going to come to you, Terry and Peter, about the cost of running one of these projects on the kind of Australian government market. But what does it kind of cost you, and the return on investment, not only in the project management and the analysis, but also the costs associated with that practice change? Did it pay for itself?
Yeah, look, it's easily paid for itself. The cost to participate in the carbon credit hasn't been all that onerous, really. It was based on a lot of historical data that we were collecting anyway for our own management purposes. We obviously didn't have that huge baselining cost, which, I think if I was to go down the path of baselining an operation of this size, we'd be talking about somewhere between 150 and 200,000 bucks worth of sort of, testing costs. Fortunately, I didn't have to do that. My soil testing costs were, maybe 5% of that. As far as the actual management change costs, we obviously implemented a lot more wire and water to get more grazing management control, and we've done some rough numbers on that. We reckon we've spent about $150 a hectare to make the changes we have, but then we can track in Maia that our grazing our yields, like our dry matter production yields, have increased by about 68% on some of the country that we've been planned grazing on now for 6-7 years. So it's a no-brainer to work out that it really hasn't cost us much. We've got a production benefit out of it that's well and truly paid for any cost we've incurred. And the other really important point I'll make, just before I hand over to another speaker, is that we didn't really set out to do this to be carbon farmers. We set out to do this for all the other reasons. We set out to do it for soil health. We set out to do it for drought resilience. We set out to do it for production benefits. And the carbon credit was really just a nice bit of fruit on the sideboard.
Yeah, that's a nice way to look at it. So it pays, and it's also just a benefit of something that you wanted to kind of engage in anyway. Terry and Peter, talk to us about the costs and potential complexities, but in a simple way, I've got a simple mind, in terms of setting up some of these projects. What are we looking at in terms of costs?
Well, I think let's start with returns and then talk about costs. A lot of the analysis that we've done, you've got internal rates of return on soil carbon projects that range from anything from 10 or 15% up to well over 100% internal rate of return. So the rate of return on it and the profitability of doing a soil carbon project, and that is under the current methodology, which is onerous and expensive. So I think we've got to look at what are we going to make out of it rather than what are just the costs. And by far and away, the biggest cost is your practice change. There's been a lot of focus on measuring costs, but it's actually insignificant compared to the cost of practice change. So if you're looking at, wire and water in many environments, that's going to be around $100 a hectare, maybe $120 a hectare, just to put wire and water in. Then maybe there's some introduced pastures, there might be some fertilization to do, there might be some legume to plant. And sometimes those costs can end up running up to around $300 or $400 a hectare. which is significantly greater than the cost of measurement, which is going to be somewhere in the range of between $3 and $5 or $6 per hectare per annum, if we look at it on an annualized basis. And that is actually going to drop with the new methodology, which is moving into a measured, modeled sort of method. So the amount of sampling going forward will be reduced as the models get more and more accurate. So I tend to look at it as returns, and the returns can be very good. But I totally agree with Matt, is that you need to be going into this for productivity changes, to increasing profitability through those practice changes. Carbon and other environmental credits to come out of this are a byproduct, not the primary reason.
So if I just could add a little bit, I agree with everything that Terry just said. And if I added one thing, if you look at the return that Matt's getting from the practice change that he's implemented, both in terms of wire and water, but also the sort of human capital and the way they've adopted all of these principles, he's talking about a 68% return. That's normalized for rainfall. 68% return in production. That dwarfs the carbon revenue. That is huge. So this whole exercise pays for itself. The carbon is, as he says, it's just a bit of icing on top. And what we need to be focusing on here is how we can adopt the practice change in an incremental way to gradually get those 68% returns, because the whole thing will then pay for itself. So yes, we can, the tools can sort of lower the costs of the carbon project and all the rest of it, but the big piece of pie we're going after here is that 68% that Matt got, right? If we can get the 68%, everything else is going to follow from that.
I don't want to hear, hey, it's the benefits beyond trading, and trading can be one of those opportunities to diversify farm income, but there's so many other benefits. I would like to ask all of you, does size matter in terms of carbon trading projects that we're talking about, size of properties, engaging in this?
The answer to that.
Can you smaller landholder as in not a small person, but small area, can you engage?
Size certainly does matter. There's overheads on a carbon project are the same whether you've got 500 hectares or 5,000 hectares. And as you move down into smaller scale, what your profitability will rely on is actually higher sequestration rates. So if you had a 200 or 300, 400 hectare property where you're able to actually sequester 3 tonnes of carbon per hectare per annum, that's probably still viable. But if you're only going to sequester 1 or half a tonne of carbon per hectare, then may not be viable. So it's actually the combination of sequestration rate and scale. And the bigger properties tend to be in lower rainfall areas, maybe poorer soils, and they can get away with lower sequestration rates because of the larger scale. So it does matter, but it's a two-edged sword.
So Suze, could I just add to that?
Yeah.
So technology can help a little bit here. So potentially technology can help you to sort of lower some of those base costs, which lowers the barrier to entry and allows you to get a smaller project. But it can also facilitate the idea of aggregated projects where maybe a number of small properties kind of collect together and treat themselves as one project. And potentially over time that will become feasible, and the technology will make it easier to do that. But again, I kind of want to come back to what we were saying before. The big prize we're going after here is the improved soil, so it may well be that it's not economic to do all of that testing that Terry's talking about in order to get the carbon revenue, but you've still got the better soil, and the better soil is giving you improved carrying capacity and improved production and moisture retention and all the other sorts of things. That's the big payoff anyway. So effectively, you should be thinking about it. A carbon project doesn't necessarily need to deliver dollars in carbon. It's giving you dollars in other ways anyway, if you focus on the soil.
Man, this is awesome. Like, this is what I love to hear, because this is what I talk about all the time. And it's so nice to kind of hear that consensus. There is no argument anywhere about the soil health benefits of increasing soil organic matter and the practices that can do that. Doug, I'm going to go to you now. So tell us, we talk about size may matter in terms of that cost of actually setting up some of these projects, but we know that people of all shapes and sizes, properties in different locations can be part of the journey to increase soil carbon. what's MLA doing in this space to, I guess, enable producers to do that?
Yeah, so this probably speaks to our plan of attack under the Red Meat Industries Carbon Neutral 2030 initiative. So a reminder, we're investing in technologies and practices and then enabling systems. So on the technologies and practices front, we're working with innovative companies who are coming up with lower cost, scalable, accurate methods to do the baselining work. So we're supporting R&D in that area, and that's quite a rapidly evolving area of work due to greater access to satellite technology, hardware, software, etc. There's also the plants themselves. So different plants are a technology. So supporting the evolution of new plant technologies that are going to persist in current and future climates, because as you said earlier, Suze, it's actually the plant that creates the impact, not the grazing management or the measurement technology, it's the plant. So supporting the innovation in new plant species and diversity is another area of importance. And then I see on the chat function, there's been quite a few comments and suggestions and links to MLA programs that are in our leadership and capacity building areas. So how do we translate this knowledge and awareness of these technologies to producers through things like producer extension and engagement initiatives like MLA's EDGE initiatives and EDGE network, the Profitable Grazing Systems Network are some examples. And then there are private examples with RCS and others that are set up an educational experience for producers to absorb that knowledge and put in place some practice change.
So Terry, we've got a question online about a bit of clarification about the approximate property size needed for a carbon project to be profitable if we're assuming quite modest sequestration rates. Is there somewhere where people can go to get some more information on that?
That's one we probably need to do offline, Suze. I'm happy if somebody sort of emails me or contacts me about that.
I'm a Terry groupie. Yeah.
It's a relatively complex answer, so it'd be.
Yep, good one. So maybe reach out to Terry there. Now, there's a question, and this is a really good point. If we're looking at the Australian landscape, and I'm going to go to you first, Matt, with this question. The Australian landscape is drying in some areas, and there's this risk and uncertainty with climate variability. If people are trading carbon or getting ACCU, so Australian Carbon Credit Units in the Australian market, should they be holding on to these to avoid some of that risk or to kind of have it as one of their assets? Matt, what do you think about that? And then Terry.
Look, no, I don't think so. I think, if you're doing your job correctly, you're building carbon all the time. The other thing is that there is a sort of already a 25% inaccuracy sort of clause built into the deal that we did. So we were really only selling, we weren't selling everything that we thought we'd accumulated. So there's a bit of, up your sleeve for inaccuracies and what have you. But I'm very comfortable to sell that, knowing that going forward, I'm going to continue to sequester more and more carbon, in my soil. So and having the ability to have a more resilient landscape to be able to better manage those drier periods, I think that's where the real benefit to my business is.
I'm not sure if you answered, did size matter? Does size matter?
Look, I think, in the deal that we did, it did, because the particular customer was looking for a tranche of a certain size. They wanted sort of close to 100,000 tonnes. So we couldn't even provide that on our own, and we're a reasonably large operation. That's why the deal was sort of done with Wilmot and other producers to be able to package that up to be able to deal with that particular customer. So I think yes, size is relevant at the moment, but obviously there's a lot of there's intricacies within that, and as Terry touched on.
And was it a 25-year contract?
Yes, 25. Yep. It's a 25-year contract. Yeah.
And what criteria did they approach you with? Just quickly before I go to Terry about that, should you hold on to your credits question? So what criteria did Microsoft use?
I don't quite understand what you mean by
In
criteria.
terms of what kind of evidence did they require, I think perhaps that's what the question's about. So
yeah, okay. So obviously, I mean, the evidence was quite detailed. They obviously looked at soil test data. We then provided bulk density figures on all of our soil. They did remote monitoring. They also, wanted to see, they wanted evidence of all the other natural capital kind of initiatives that we'd undertaken through our thing. The whole thing was independently audited. That was the other process involved in the deal, was that an independent auditing firm came through. I think that audit took about 8 days work, so it was quite detailed. And there was also sorts of experts in their field that conducted that audit process. I think a lot of what we did you can find on the Regen Network website, if anybody's interested in further reading.
The important part of that data, Suze, was that they also used the data to be able to substantiate that actually made substantial practice change. So the data is used in a number of different ways because you have to show that you've made changes and that those changes had an effect.
yeah.
And so they were able to use the data for both of those things.
Tell us about you tell us your take on the data and what tools were used in that.
Oh, well, so I wasn't sort of trying to lead into an answer.
Oh, no, I'm leading the question.
I just that, for example, in MaiaGrazing, because they're recording every graze and they're recording rest periods and densities and all the rest of it, we can actually show that they have actually changed what they've done with grazing management. So they have actually made interventions that meet the eligibility criteria for that particular scheme to show that they actually have adopted all the key principles of grazing management and how they've applied them. And then we can link that to outcomes. And all of that just comes out of the fact that they're using a proper digital tool for doing that grazing management.
Nailed it. That kind of linked into some questions that are happening online. So I just wanted to draw that out. So thanks, Peter. Perfect. Terry, over to you. And then Doug will want to talk a little bit about permanence. But Terry, should people hang on to their carbon credits if they get them, or should you be trading them? This is a question from the floor.
I think there's 2 or 3 issues around this. One is if you want to be carbon neutral, then you won't be selling your credits. And you might have some you've got to retain and they have to be retired, and you may have some to trade. So the fact that you actually create credits and sell them does not mean that you're carbon neutral. So that's the first thing. I think the second is under the current methodology, you're only going to get credits from soil carbon every 3 to 5 years. And therefore, and I would be holding some of those over, not as a risk management strategy, but to cover off on things like bad seasons, low prices. So I think that using carbon credits that you have in a bank account or in your carbon credit account can be used as a hedge against the variability in cash flow that we have in agriculture. So I would certainly encourage people to keep some aside for that, but then it will depend on, whether you need the cash flow out of it or not. But we are moving over the next, 5 to 10 years in Australia to annual cash flow out of with the new methodology. So I think that gives a little more flexibility about when you sell them.
Thank you very much, Terry. Doug, did you want to comment on this, or in particular, I guess, how MLA collects information about achieving carbon neutrality and some of the steps?
Sure. So just want to support Terry's comment there from a market perspective. Be aware that if the farm wants to be a market as a neutral position, it needs to account for that before it sells any surplus credits. And that real life example might be a price grid from a processor that you're supplying that might have a market specification for carbon credits along with the livestock you supply them. So I would envisage we'll start to see that market dynamic emerge in the not too distant future. So in terms of your question, Suze, about how MLA accounts for it, at this stage, we call it a top-down approach as opposed to bottom-up. There's 2 ways in which you can account for this. The top-down approach is using the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory. So the federal government has its own greenhouse gas inventory that when Prime Minister Morrison attends international agreements, they use that data set to show what progress the country's made. So in that data set is an agricultural subset, and within the agricultural subset is a red meat subset. And so we use the red meat subset combined with the land use and land use change data set that the government also sits in the national inventory to track industry progress over time. But it's a very different approach, and that approach isn't suitable to enterprise level reporting, so bottom up reporting. So at the farm level, you need to collect your own data if you want to make a business statement in this area. And that's using tools like MaiaGrazing and others, combining that with other data sources to build your own picture. With that in mind, MLA has a carbon accounting tool that developed out at the University of Melbourne that is freely available. So producers can play around with that. And we'll expect that that tool will evolve a little bit over the next couple of years as we get more feedback on its user friendliness.
Right. Thanks, Doug. we're just gonna do some rapid fire and questions online because people are saying, answer our question, please. So let's first of all go to, should we worry about carbon in trees, tree lines, shelter belts, or should we just be looking at soil carbon? Would anyone like to think about that? So I see that as a value carbon stacking question and a co-benefits question, but I don't know if someone else would like to comment on that. I think most certainly we're moving to
sure. Yes, it's a carbon store and can be measured and accounted for in the system. So yes.
Yeah, and that carbon stacking, so looking and I guess co-benefit stacking is an emerging market interest, which is really important because we're managing landscapes and our management influences landscape processes and functions. And so certainly Matt's commented on the fact that they took into account a whole lot of other factors other than soil carbon in their deal. Is that correct, Matt?
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct. Yeah, they did take into account, riparian restoration areas, biological set-aside areas where we were no longer stocking for biodiversity, encouragement, tree planting programs, that sort of stuff. Yeah,
and looking at what you did, it was a great way of kind of land sharing rather than land sparing as well, looking at how production can happen within the landscape with these other benefits occurring around it, which I think was a really good example, Matt. Question about carbon saturation. So Terry, I'm going to go to you first and then I'm going to give my take on it.
Yeah, because I think you and I might differ a little on this, Suze.
We haven't had an argument yet, guys.
Yeah,
Come on,
no.
let's say something controversial. Peter, I thought you'd say something controversial.
We might have one now. I think that so there's a few things with carbon saturation. Firstly, most of our soils have very, very low carbon levels relative to the saturation potential of them. The second is that carbon has the ability to go down. And a lot of measurements that have been made around carbon have been made in the top 10 or 15 centimetres. Our measurements are showing that when you go down to 1 metre to 1.5 metres, there is more tonnes of carbon. I think on every project we've done, more tonnes of carbon below 30 centimetres than there is above 30 centimetres. And I think we've got the ability to add significant amount of carbon to depth. And then I look at saturation being a percentage number, but I do believe that stock and adding to stock is a different thing to a percent saturation. So my view is that there is absolutely no limit to how much carbon you can put onto a soil, because once you've reached a saturation point, all you will do is build soil, and I can't see any problem with that.
For the record, for those of you playing along at home, we actually haven't had this discussion before, but I think we've had producers ask us both the same question. So my take on it actually is very, very similar, Terry. So there's a huge opportunity to increase soil carbon in subsoil components, and that's less saturated. That means the clay, for me, that means that the clay in our subsoil has less organomineral associations of organic carbon compounds with it. What does that mean? Basically, clay protects carbon through these important relationships between the carbon molecules and the clay minerals within the soil. So the more clay, the more carbon you can protect, right? So that's clay associated carbon. So one of my research papers looked at going, right, let's take high carbon soils from the Monero. So these are soils with a carbon concentration in the topsoil of 9% on our basalt soil, so super high. And can I load that system up and accumulate carbon in the humic fraction? So I was saying, can we go beyond the carbon saturation associated with clay and build humus? Because humus, by its nature, is more stable in the soil. It accounts for about 60%, 70% of our total organic carbon. So, and humus is microbes and microbial products, right? So if we can keep feeding bugs in our soil with organic matter, and they need nutrients as well, but if we can keep that process building and build humus in our soil, can we overcome that clay associated carbon saturation rule? And the data says, yes, you can. No argument, Jerry. So building soil.
Geez,
There you go.
disappointed.
That's a bit boring, wasn't it? I was like kind of working up to it, like we're just gonna, no.
Well, can I pick a fight though?
Oh, yes, I told you Peter would come good.
It's
We've
not.
got a few minutes left.
I'm not sure that I'm picking a fight with either of you two, but I'm just picking a fight with others, not necessarily in this room. I mean, I have heard the argument from a lot of scientists that for any given management regime, you will eventually reach an equilibrium point. And you know, Terry and to some extent you, Suze, sort of argue with that. But let's just accept that that was true. Then the argument they mount is that therefore soil carbon is not the answer to climate change, because eventually you can't just keep going on forever. Now, what I would say is that that argument is irrelevant, because yes, okay, it may be that it doesn't mean that we can just keep burning fossil fuels forever because we can keep sequestering carbon in the soil forever, and therefore it's not the answer to turning off fossil fuels. But the big challenge that we've got over the next 20 years is that we're basically going to overshoot sort of a safe level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So we are going to need to have ways, at least in the short term, for taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And at the moment, the lowest cost way of doing that, the easiest way of doing that, as far as all the things that I've read, is in fact using photosynthesis to store the carbon in the soil through grazing management. So the fact that we can kind of pull some of it out over the next 20 or 30 years can have a huge impact to how we arrest climate change, whether or not there is some equilibrium point, 100 years down the track. I don't think that's actually the most pressing issue at the moment.
Completely.
Does that make sense?
And we've got to throw everything at this issue. And around that carbon stability, and there's a couple of comments online about this and I guess how permanent some of those changes are. Remember, you can increase more permanent or more stable carbon in soil, but you can also have a shift to a more permanent, higher flow of carbon into your soil. So if your practice change increases even the labile or more vulnerable fraction of carbon to decomposition, as long as you have that maintained higher input of biomass and organic matter supply through some of the practices that we've spoken about today and through the example that we've used with Cavan Station, then you can still have an increase in soil carbon stocks. But we've got a couple of minutes left. So if any last minute questions, put them in the chat and I'll try and get to them. Matt, how else can we add value in this space to good management? What other things are you looking at, or other than the carbon market? What else do you think, and the productivity benefits, what else is possible, and what's the next step for Cavan Station?
Yeah, I think the next frontier is product insetting. So I'd like to think we get to a point where we can sell product like wool predominantly as carbon neutral wool. How cool would it be to sort of be able to go and buy a garment and know that the garment you're purchasing has been a benefit to the planet rather than a detractor. And I can see that happening with lamb and beef. I think that's the next big frontier for the industry, is this sort of product insetting, and probably the real value in all this is going to be achieved more through the marketing of product than it is through carbon credits, I believe. Anyway, remains to be seen, but I think that's the next frontier for us. We're working towards, marketing wool that we can sell as carbon neutral.
Panel of other experts, what do you think? What's the opportunities around the value add and the next frontier? Soil carbon's part of the story.
I think there's likely to be ecological credits around water, biodiversity, ecosystem services, a whole range of other things that will be marketable over time. And while the market at the moment is certainly for carbon, I think the markets for these other things will develop, and I would suspect that within 3 to 5 years we'll see pretty substantial markets for ecological condition scores, and they are likely to be co-benefits of sequestering soil carbon. And I noticed a question in the chat before about whether government pays for those. The Queensland government has a scheme to pay for them, and the West Australian government starting a scheme to pay for them, and the federal government's investing in it. So I think that's on the table.
And I would argue that Matt's already sort of broken down the path here, because in many ways he was able to quantify some of those co-benefits, and that basically affected the price that he could charge for his soil carbon. So effectively, all of those co-benefits bundled into actually setting a higher price than he otherwise would have got for his voluntary credit. So that's kind of already happening.
Mm. What's MLA's thinking in this space, Doug?
Yeah, it's very consistent with Matt and Terry's comments. So at the moment, if you look at the economics of carbon markets, Australia's carbon market, so the Australian federal government's purchasing mindset is the lowest cost. So they're looking for high volume, low cost carbon credits. But to Matt's point, if you look at international markets and into the future, the supply of this commodity of a carbon credit is limited at the moment, and there's limited quality of those credits. So the way in which we produce it in Australia, because we hold ourselves to high esteem and high regard and high quality. And so I think selling that into a low value market is going to leave economic value on the table, particularly if we package it up under a branded program in a high value wool or red meat derived market. And I think you'll see the economic capture back to the producer, instead of being maybe 5 or 10 cents a kilo retail, could be 20 or 30 or 40 cents a kilo retail under a branded program. So I do believe there's greater value opportunity there. So I think Matt's intuition is on the money. And then in relation to Terry's comments, carbon is the building blocks of life. And so by building carbon in the soil, you're also creating habitat for flora and fauna. And with that comes biodiversity. And with that is meeting the need, another growing community desire for addressing biodiversity decline. So absolutely, that's the next frontier. We get the carbon cycle right, we create a really productive environment for all kinds of interesting plants and animals. Then we start to measure and verify that, package it up, sell it as a credit or sell it as a branded program.
I like that, meeting the need. That's what MLA should be. It's a good pun. That's what you guys should be talking about now with this Carbon Plus scheme that we've all just kind of agreed. That's what we agreed, right? I can mute you all and your friend's like, yeah, everyone agreed. We're going to go to last and closing comments in a minute. So just have a think about what that might be. It's been very interesting, the conversation, and I think it's been very enlightening. We've seen that the benefits beyond trading are really, really strong. Going to last comments, I'm going to finish with you, Matt. So I'm going to start with you, Terry. What are your 5 closing remarks for people listening today?
I just think it's a no-brainer. I think get in and increase productivity, and that should be your focus: productivity, profitability, and then carbon and other credits. And I think Doug's comment there on the carbon cycle, if you increase the carbon cycle, you improve the water cycle and you improve the nitrogen cycle. So there's a whole lot of benefits come out of it. Just get on with it.
It's not a trade-off, right?
No, it's not.
It's not like one, it's not, oh, I'm increasing soil carbon, so good. It's not a trade-off at all. Peter?
You just stole my thunder.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, I guess my first point is that in the context of this whole conversation, it's really all about grazing management. It's not really about carbon. The carbon just happens what you want to focus on is getting your grazing management under control as quickly as you can so that you get those production benefits. And I guess the second point I was going to make, but you just did make, was that you don't have to give something up here. There's a sort of a general perception that when you're going for these carbon credits, somehow you're going to have to set aside part of your land, or you're going to have to destock or whatever. That's just simply not the case. You're actually improving your production outcomes. You don't have to give something up. It truly is a win-win. And I think that's a really important thing for people to understand.
Yeah. Doug?
It's always a challenge to try and come up with something
program
different.
that you're leading, I think we all just agreed. MLA, meeting the needs of carbon farmers.
Yeah, look, I'm just going to try and reflect on what might be some take-home messages. So, you know, we're clear on there are multiple benefits. So there are multiple reasons to invest in carbon storage in soils. So that's a given. I think if you're a producer or a practitioner on the call wanting to go home with something, I think it's very important that you do your homework on the different ways in which you can create, in particular, soil carbon credits. Be mindful of there are multiple buyers for that benefit out there. So do your homework on that, understand the market and where it's going before you kind of lock into a way of working. And then I think for people like me and organisations like MLA, we've got to really focus on accelerating straightforward carbon accounting removal technologies and practices, and the technologies to support the measurement and the verification of that. So I call out to people online is put some trust in us and organisations like yours too, Susan, like state government organisations, to work with technologies to bring that to life, those practices, such that the producers, once they've done their homework and they're satisfied with the marketing opportunities, can activate and get on with the job.
Some good take-home messages. Matt, for the second last word, I'll have the final word. What do you think?
Yeah, look, I think it's just about making better decisions. You know, it's about trying something new. It's about collecting data. It's about planning. So feed budgeting. So none of it's rocket science, but it's all things that quite often people just sort of think that they're doing intrinsically, but you just have to, you've got to document more, you've got to collect more data, you've got to plan more, and you've got to do something. You can't manage what you can't measure, and you've got to start somewhere. So yeah, have a crack.
Thank you, Matt. There are such immense public good benefits from privately managed agricultural land, and we've heard about that today. I've found the Cavan Station story really inspirational because what it's done is got more people talking about the benefits of increasing soil carbon. There's market benefits, there's productivity benefits, and there's very well documented environmental benefits as well. We've heard about today about enabling producers, collecting data, empowering people, and making more informed decisions. We've heard that the data is out there. We know that there's some limitations around maybe soils and climate, but we've also heard that there's some limitations around mindsets and paradigms, right? So the challenge for you who have participated today and listening to our forum is to think about what you can do differently with this information. Make sure you keep asking questions of everyone. I'd like to say thank you to MaiaGrazing for hosting this event today, and a very special thank you to our panelists, and especially Matt, who shared his story today as well. There's been a wealth of expertise. Thank you for sharing your time and coming on this journey with us, learning more about carbon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Suze. You've done a wonderful job.
Well done, Suze.
Thanks, Suze.